Well, as you heard from Penny's introduction, we have Priten Soundar-Shah here, and he's written this beautiful book I'm holding in my hands for those of you that can see the video. It's called Ethical Ed Tech: How Educators Can Lead on AI and Digital Safety in K through 12, which, if you listen to my podcast with any regularity, you know we've had a number of these conversations, including Jared Horvath Cooney, who wrote the book, The Digital Delusion, whose podcast came out not too long ago, and we had a very, very important dialogue on a lot of these issues. When I saw the announcement from Priten's PR agent come through and the contents of his new book, I felt I should look into it. So I did, and I thought that it was different enough in approach, and Priten's view seems to be different enough that I thought it would be a great exploration for everybody, because a lot of us have children and they are our future. And I know, Priten, from looking into you a little bit, you've also written another book called AI and the Future of Education, Teaching in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And so it'll be interesting for you to share your views on how maybe things have changed now that you have a couple more years of experience with that. And so I'm excited to dive into this. I looked through your book. I read some of the case histories. It looks to me like it's really more of a book for educators than it is just the general public. But I think for the reasons of concern that people now have, it's probably an important book for everybody that wants to understand what's really going on in the education system. So with that said, welcome. It's great to have you here to share with us, Priten.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited.
Yeah, thank you. I like to get to know my guests to start with. So I like everybody to understand, who they're talking to, what their background is, what shapes their worldview. I was excited to see you have a background in philosophy, because I have a deep background in philosophy as well. I think that's very missing today in many people's worldview. So I think that's great. But maybe give us just an overview of your history, your education, your passions, and what maybe is important to you today. I know obviously this book's important to you because you wrote it. So I'd love to hear how that all came about inside of you.
Yeah. So my journey to this book is long and winded, but I'll try to give a Spark Notes version. I started my first education technology nonprofit as a first year in high school. And
oh, cool.
That's really when all this starts, and it kind of evolves, obviously, across the next decade and a half through different phases of my life. But that's the current of figuring out the role that technology can and should play in education has kind of been the undercurrent through all of that. So I eventually take a gap year between high school and college to work on that nonprofit. And at that time, I started working with other organizations as well to help them also figure out what role technology can play in their nonprofits. Those projects are still around today, and so that's what I work on a daily basis. But during my undergraduate years, I approached this from the angle of philosophy. That's where I started thinking about what role education plays in a healthy democracy and what education needs to look like in order to make sure that all of our citizens are prepared to engage both with the government, but also with each other, most importantly. And that ends up shaping a lot of the work I do in the civic space in terms of what education needs to look like for our students, to actually understand what problems exist and how they might tackle them using a variety of disciplinary lenses. And then I go back to school for a master's in policy. And so that kind of shifts the conversation from, what are our fundamental values and what are the bedrock reasoning behind why we teach and what we teach, to how might we institutionalize that and figure out ways to make that into policies, whether it be at the federal level or locally at our school level. And throughout this time, I'm also wearing all these different hats and trying to figure out how I can be a practitioner in the education space. And so that's everything from spending a semester abroad teaching English in South Korea, to hosting a summer camp for middle school students, to working part-time at a bachelor's university for adult learners. And so I really try to figure out different ways that I can play different roles in education to really understand education from all those different angles. Yeah, so that's hopefully a SparkNotes version that gives some context to all the different backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah, where are you actually from?
So my family's from India, but I grew up in suburban New York, and I'm now located in the Boston area.
What would you describe it is that you do? It seems to me like you're doing several things at once, which it's cool, but
Yeah.
I'm kind of having a hard time putting my mind around what does Priten actually do?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think I ask myself that all the time. But I do think I have three distinct roles, and I think they all kind of occupy my time differently in each week. But I think that there's I run these nonprofits, two of them that work with teachers and with students to figure out what the future of education needs to look like. And so that's things like providing professional development to schools and working directly with teachers to figure out what, which tools they might use, how they might respond to the tools their students are using. And then we build curriculum through that other nonprofit for teachers to use in their classrooms on their own. And that really covers things like, how might we teach about climate change? How might we teach about, a representative governments and bring all those disciplines into the K to 12 level. So that's one bucket. I also teach part-time, and that's really important to me. And so I work at College and Bound, which is that college that focuses on providing adult learners with a path to a bachelor's degree. And I teach really fun classes. I get to teach classes on the philosophy of family. I teach epistemology classes, which are that is my favorite topic to teach. And then I teach classes to pre-service teachers on education technology. So that's my second hat. So there's the nonprofit hat, there's the educator hat, and then there's this I work with other companies to build. I actually build tech tools myself. So I do have a computer science background, and it's also I'll code tools for other nonprofits and schools that are looking to figure out a way to use technology in their operations or in their work. And so all three of those hats are at all times. And yeah, so there is no one box I can put myself in, and I find that frustrating. So I hope that's not too much of a convoluted answer.
I think it's important to have the diversity. You're talking about these nonprofits, but you haven't mentioned names or anything.
Yeah.
They seem to me something maybe the audience might want to know more about.
Yeah.
How do people find them, and why might they want to get involved?
Yeah. So the first is Pedagogy Futures, and that is our teacher and school-facing organization that provides professional development on figuring out how we can make sure that the use of technology in schools is human-centered and not necessarily tech-centered. And I'm sure we'll get into lots of what that means during the rest of the episode. And that's what the book's work is through. And so the book is written as a ancillary to some of the professional development work that we do with educators in that space. The second is Academy for Social Civics, and that's the organization where we build curriculum for teachers to use in their classrooms. And so what we basically do is we take the liberal arts, and so we take philosophy, psychology, literature, history, and we find ways to teach students about those topics at the K to 12 level to broaden their understanding of the world. But that's a really tough task because you can't just say, okay, let's start giving every single ninth grader a philosophy class because education is slow to move, and there's standardized testing, and there's curricula that they have to adapt to. It's complicated to get much change so concretely. And so the approach that we've taken is a very piecemeal one. We build lesson plans that a teacher can integrate within pre-existing standards. And so if you're already having to teach a U.S. history requirement, here's how you might teach this philosophical concept to connect to that. And that's been our approach, is how do we slowly trickle some of this into the K-12 system rather than really, wait out a broad philosophy course, which I think that the path to that is much more complicated. I wanted to make sure that teachers could figure out a way to do this today. So that's the Academy for Social Civics. We also host a middle school camp through that, which is one of my favorite times of year. And so we get middle school students for 3 weeks this summer, and we work with them 1 week on their persuasive writing, 1 week on their public speaking, and 1 week we have them do an entrepreneurial sprint to building this year a vibe-coded AI solution to a problem in their community. So that's also super fun. But that's through that second nonprofit.
Okay. Who pays for this stuff that you're producing? And I doubt the teachers are paying out of their pockets. They hardly make anything. And it would be hard to get school boards to pay for it because they're regulated above themselves. I'm just curious, how are you able to do that?
Yeah. So The Pedagogy Futures Project, we do charge schools and teachers for the professional development. And so there are pre-existing budget line items at most schools. We most of the time are very flexible with schools because it's a nonprofit. So while we obviously have operational costs to keep folks available and for us to fly somewhere and do professional development, that is usually, we try to meet the schools where they are in terms of what their budget line items for professional development are. The Academy for Social Civics project is completely free. All of that curriculum we put out is available free of cost on the internet. People can go in and use whatever they want. And so that's all largely self-funded. I sponsor all of that material because that really is my passion project. That's what I feel the most strongly about. And so we don't charge for that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, with the issues, especially since COVID, the percentage of people going to public schools is dropping pretty significantly, as you know, and I think for a lot of good reasons myself. Are people that are engaging in homeschooling able to access your education and use that for homeschooling projects?
Absolutely, and we actually see a lot of homeschooling parents use some of our materials because they're largely ready to go out of the box, and that really is the approach we take. And so there's an animated video that they can watch. There's a follow-up like lesson plan and worksheet, and then a like interactive activity that goes with every single lesson we put out. And so we do see homeschooling parents use that. And then all of our teacher-facing professional development is also available online, oftentimes with just a free account for most of our asynchronous work. And so all of that is also available to anybody who plays a role as an educator in any capacity.
And does this cover things like mathematics and what are the topics that it covers that a school, that a parent would need to, or at least want to potentially include for their child's education?
Yeah, so we do. It is a liberal arts framework, and so the kinds of things that you'll see, on which the maths and sciences are a part of it, but there is data science stuff, there is statistics stuff, and then the science stuff is largely focused on understanding things like climate science. And so a lot of the science and math things it's in relation to actual issues that like we face in daily society, and the rest of the content is the philosophy, the history, the sociology. We do a lot of cognitive biases and logical fallacies, which I think are really important for people to understand. Mm-hmm. We do, bedrock philosophy, and a lot of like government. So the Supreme Court cases, the amendments, the Federalist Papers, like kind of go through the history of democracy. So we do like, Greek democracy. We do like representative versus direct democracy. Lots of different topic areas that kind of think about that are all jointly important for somebody to really figure out what their role in a democratic country is, and so it tackles that from all sorts of angles. The larger approach that I think is a good shortcut to like think about the kinds of content we put out is our goal is to make sure that every student, if they pick up a New York Times, paper, can turn to any of the sections and make some sense of it and be able to contextualize that information into their own understanding. And so whether that be the science section with the latest breakthroughs in science, or it be a political section of a conflict happening somewhere in the world, and they kind of have some background to make sense of that and put that into their own context.
Well, I got an interesting question for you because I've looked into the climate change issue quite extensively, and there's a lot of deception going on there. When you're creating education on something like that, how are you protecting yourself from the bias of the globalists and manipulated science and things that are used to coerce people into buying into things just like they did with COVID, so we don't mislead people? How are you getting to the root of that?
Yeah, so we work on building fundamental like literacy skills. So, for example, we might spend some time teaching students what the tragedy of the commons is, right? So that's a behavioral economics phenomena, and so the application of that within how they think about this in the greater context is up to them. And so we have taken great care to make sure that our content is politically neutral in that way, because what we would rather empower students to do is learn the fundamental concepts and figure out how that applies to their latest context and the latest updates in any domain. And so that's why we draw so heavily from like history and philosophy and psychology and behavioral economics, for example, because then that kind of helps them use that to reason through whatever information that they're processing in that moment.
I think that's outstanding. You're one of the first educators I've ever heard actually teaching children how to think instead of what to think.
It's important, and the line is really blurry, and I sympathize with that. Like obviously at any point there are value judgments that we're making, even so it's not neutral is a loaded word there, because obviously we have a commitment to democracy and liberalism in our work, right? So we do think it's very important for children to be able to like think freely and converse with each other about important issues, and those are value judgments, right? Like that might not be shared amongst everyone, but we try to censor those as our value judgments rather than anything else. That maybe is a more accurate way of putting it than just fully neutral.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm curious, you obviously put a lot of work into writing ethical ed tech. It's not a massive book, but it's rich. There's a lot on every page, and it's very, very well thought out, by the way. It's very clean to read, very methodical, very builds nicely. But what was it that you felt like you needed to do this for? Like, what? Obviously, you put a lot of work into this. There must have been something you said, look, we've got to address this. I'm curious what it was. What was the illness that you were creating medicine for?
Yeah. So, and I think you alluded to this earlier too, that like a lot of my early work when the technology first became popular was in building technical literacy amongst educators. And so one of the problems that existed, in 2023 and honestly still exists today is that the gap between what the technology can do and its impact on society and what the average educator understands about technology is really wide. And we did a lot of work during the pandemic with some of our consulting work with schools to help schools transition to online learning. And that was a really difficult task because tech literacy is not high. A lot of classrooms don't use a lot of technology and didn't, especially pre the online learning phase. And so we were working with teachers to help them understand how a Zoom call works and how to, mute a student in a Zoom call or leave a Zoom call or host a Zoom call. And so when you think about that, and then you think about 2 years later, and suddenly everybody's having to gain literacy about artificial intelligence, that's huge. You go from a Zoom call to artificial intelligence, and we have a lot of work to do to catch folks up to understand what how technology is built and what it can do and what it can't do. So I started a lot of my work in that space, was building, figuring out how to translate the tech knowledge and vocabulary that I had with other educators so they could understand it too. What I realized is that very quickly that conversation was getting co-opted. And as much as I wanted individual educators in schools to be making the decisions about what role technology played in their classrooms, there became this surge of the large tech companies kind of taking over the conversation. And so decision-making power was really taken away from teachers. And that's traditionally been the case for most movements in education, where as things become popular, we take away more and more autonomy and professional judgment from the individual educator, and we go with the fad of the time. And that's basically what's been happening a lot with the growth of artificial intelligence and education technology more broadly. And what I realized was, of course, you need technical literacy to understand and make decisions about this, but we also need to build basic ethical reasoning skills in order to actually think about the questions. And so that was the goal with the book, was if we're actually going to navigate whatever lies ahead and whatever growth of this technology looks like for larger society, we're all going to have to ask the right questions first alongside learning about the technology. And so that's really where the professional interest in the book comes in. There's also personal interest. And I think that one of the other things that I noticed is that we went from kind of putting our, digging our head into the sand when the technology came out and saying, oh, we're just going to ban it from our schools and completely, figure out ways to keep it out, to bringing it in full force. And so we saw lots of schools start to figure out every way that they can possibly integrate the technology. And this is largely driven by, again, the larger narrative that these tech companies are putting out. And that scared me because, as someone who wants to be a parent, I think that what I most value about education is the human part of it. And I think as I saw technology kind of start to take over, I think my concerns became, how do we slow this down so folks are asking the right questions? And that's the personal part of the motivation behind the book.
I think it's fantastic. It's super important. And I would encourage you to write one for a more global perspective, because, the thing is that, as you surely know, people are starting to use AI instead of their own brains for everything. And, asking the right question is part of it, but having enough depth of understanding to know whether or not what you're being told back by AI is just junk or is just a bias built into the programming. Kind of like the whole thing with rigging search engines and how easy you can manipulate people. It seems to me that your next step should be to take on the bigger issue, because there's kids and parents and then there's the rest of the world, which is unfortunately a lot bigger and in a lot of trouble right now because of their inability to think rationally and understand the technology and the biases and the ways that people's minds can get manipulated. And, I could go on and on with all this because I've looked into this a lot, but it's a serious problem that I think it takes someone with your knowledge base on both sides of education, technology, democracy, philosophy, to actually be able to put a package together that helps bring somebody into a clear enough sense of focus and understanding that we don't all get lost and end up going, we really fucked that up. Now we're down shit's creek without a paddle.
Yeah.
Because I think we're getting close.
If you are enjoying this podcast and the topic of shadow work intrigues you, then we'd like to invite you to join Paul's Spirit Gym priority notification list. Spirit Gym members share their experiences and aha moments, as well as supporting each other's personal growth and helping one another to find and live a life filled with meaning and purpose. Coming soon, Paul is releasing a whole new dimension to the Spirit Gym community, and you can be one of the first to learn more and grab the opportunity. Head over to myspiritgym.com and sign up to be notified when doors open. That's myspiritgym.com to join the priority notification list.
That's always the challenge with being in the education space and trying to adapt to something that's moving so quickly, is that a lot of the problems that we're facing, we can't really wait for current children to kind of grow up and have, assuming I can influence every single student tomorrow, even then it's too slow in some ways to solve a lot of the problems. And so, it's something that we think about a lot. A lot of the work that I'm trying to do these days is also directly to parents. And so that's another way that I'm trying to bridge some of that gap in terms of getting some more adults to understand this. And while it's couched in a conversation about what that means for their children, it also applies to them oftentimes. And so
absolutely,
I think that does, that's one way we're trying to venture a little bit more broadly. But a lot of the content that we put out, especially for Academy for Social Civics, anybody around the world of any age could really watch and make sense of it. And we do, because it's all put out publicly, we do, and for free, we do get folks who are just a random person who's interested in a topic who comes and watches some of our content to gain some more knowledge on it, which I am, I think I'm proud of that. I think I like that it's not just focused on K-12 students, and everybody finds some value in that kind of knowledge.
Well, I'm glad I can help get you some more exposure for that. I think there's, my podcast is currently listened to in 172 countries. So there's people all over the world homeschooling and concerned about these issues. And I think it's what you're doing is very, very important. I'm glad I made the decision to get you on the podcast. In my research prep for the podcast, I found that you hosted a podcast titled The Margin of Thought. I thought that was quite a provocative title. And it made me want to ask you, what is at the margin of thought from your perspective?
Yeah. So there's, I think in my mind when I named the podcast, it was actually in response to this book that we had to read in sixth grade. And my history teacher at that time had assigned us a summer reading book called How to Read. And as a fairly academic, nerdy little kid, I was very, very skeptical that at that point I needed to read a book on how to read. And once I did, it really did change how I approached reading for the rest of my life, including how I read today. And one of the, very basic concepts, again, as a sixth grader, this was mind blowing, was that you should annotate your book and fully, that's how you take full ownership of it, was by writing in the margins of the book.
Well, you should see my books. I destroy them.
Well, I saw a Post-it at least hanging out of mine, so I could tell that you were also a book annotator, and you take ownership of your book. And I think that's I do think that that's where all of the best thinking happens, is when you're actually actively engaging and including your own thought processes when you're taking in information. And so that was one of the first ideas of the margin idea, was that all the thinking, that real good thinking, doesn't happen in just hearing this narrative from somebody. It happens in this interactive way where you kind of get to say, wait, I need to figure more. I don't really get this. I'm going to go look something more up about this, or I don't really agree with this. This was a point where, even though this author largely, and I'm sure you had those moments with me where you're like, well, I don't know if that's exactly right. And then there are points where you're like, I might say something like this to somebody else. And kind of being able to do that process, I think, really represents the kind of learning that needs to take place for productive outcomes, rather than just, reading for the sake of reading, or learning for the sake of learning. And so that's where the name for the podcast comes from. It's the idea that we're having these conversations at the margin of the on the margin of our pages, rather than somebody just coming on and sharing something without a real interactive dialogue. And I think you mentioned that the dialogue format here as well. I think that's important.
Yeah, I leave arguments for authors all the time in the books. Like if they're saying something about whatever, God, religion, or food science, or whatever, I'll write right in the book, say, this is incorrect. This person needs to study the following books. And I do that knowing that, because I own an educational institution. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I started the Chek Institute in 1995, and we have over 70,000 students worldwide. Wow. And so I know when I die, people will be looking through my library, and they'll see all the messages I've left, and it'll help them think deeper and ask better questions. And because I'm always doing research for podcasts as I'm reading people's books, what about this? What about that?
Yeah.
I did a podcast.
And that's the most productive type of thinking. So that's great.
Yeah. I did a podcast with a guy who wrote a book on the ego, but it was so full of holes. I said, here, I better give you this book if you really want some feedback on your book. All my notes are in the book. I've written and read.
Yeah.
Pretty funny. Now, since we're talking about the margins of thought, I think it's important to consider for everybody listening that at the margins of thought is also creativity, is the imaginal dimension, is contemplative meditation, where you go beyond just the rational digestion of something. And, for example, if someone asks you, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Thought won't give you the answer. All it'll do is just come up with stuff that a Zen master would laugh at. So you have to go beyond thought into the contemplative zone of mystery. And I think, it's as important for children and adults to go beyond thought. And Einstein said creativity is more important than thinking. And I think he had a very important point there. Anyhow,
yeah.
And
I think that's what's going to separate us from a lot of the artificial intelligence technology too, is I think
that's exactly right. Yeah. I'm forever having debates with artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
For these very reasons. I think that the way thinking was done a long time ago, probably, prior to the Industrial Revolution, was a lot different than it is now. I think I think the more we've engaged with machines, the more mechanical our thinking processes have become. And thinking now, I think, forms a lot of people's opinions, but it's lacking experience. It's like I grew up on a farm. I can tell you there's a big difference between reading about working on a farm and actually being on a farm. You can read about castrating an animal, but when you're actually holding the damn thing and cutting its balls open and hearing it scream, that you can't get that from a book, and you can't get that from a thinking process. That's an experiential process. And I feel that our education systems have gotten so into the dimension of mind that we lack that. We're almost becoming like AI. We lack the actual basis of experience, without which you can't actually filter good knowledge from bad knowledge. And so what you end up with is just a bunch of believers, and that's, exactly how we get religious wars, is believer against believer, all forgetting that they're human.
Yeah. You also, there's a classic problem in epistemology that talks about whether you can truly learn about some things solely through testimonial knowledge. And so that's like when one person shares with another. And one of the particular examples is oftentimes a very simple example of color or taste, where, you have somebody in a black and white room and you're trying to, you tell them everything you possibly can about the color red. And you tell them the wavelength, you tell them, what other, what things in the real world are that. You tell it in relation to, it's a little bit darker than orange, and, it's the whatever, right? Like you kind of explain all of that. And then does that person actually know what red is, right? Like just through all of that information, is that enough to get them to understand what red is? And I think most of us would say, no, like there is something that is not verbal about the experience of the color red. And that no matter how much you just share information, there's still something about knowledge that is left out without actually seeing red. And I think that, your farm example is a perfect one where you can read all about it and hear all about it from somebody else who's been there. But there is something lost and left out, rather, when you're not, the first person experience of it. It does add a quality that's unique.
I would just hand somebody a pin and say, poke your finger and you can experience red right now, no matter what color the room is.
Fair enough. Philosophers would, lots of restraints will probably be placed on the thought experiment to avoid things like that. But the general idea being somebody who hasn't seen the color red, it never does. Yeah.
My tendency is to think outside of the box so that I don't let philosophers and people like that completely box my head in. Yeah, great. Now, how important is ethical ed tech for parents and potentially university students to read and understand? How might it change the decisions they make?
Yeah, I think that parents we are actively talking to, and I do think this is really important for parents to also gain understanding of. And that's because, as you know, one of the core arguments in the book is that a lot of ethical decision making is about stakeholder engagement and ensuring that we talk to the people that we are trying to work with and actually take their opinion into account, but also their needs into account. And I think parents being able to articulate what exactly their value systems are for education, parents knowing which questions to ask about the risks of this technology, and parents knowing what sorts of things are actually even possible in terms of both the good but also the bad in our schools when this technology is growing, I think is really important. So for parents in particular, I do think that there's a lot of benefit, and we've kind of put out some guides about which chapters are most useful for a parent, and how they might translate that into a conversation with their school. University students is an interesting audience that I don't know if I've thought about concretely, honestly. I think that when I do think that the first section of the book, the philosophy section, is probably the most relevant for a university audience. And I think that for those students, it might help ground them in why they're going to college in the first place, because I talk so much about the purpose of education and what it really serves in a society. And I think that gosh, if I could get a few of those chapters read by every university student across the country, I think I would be very, very pleased. Because part of the problem is that I think folks are not, they go through the motions of education without pausing to think about what the value of it often is in the first place. And if we can get students to slow down and do that thinking as well, I think that would be amazing.
I know when I left school, I only finished the 9th grade. I got so disgusted with it, I couldn't take it anymore. But I know that a lot of students, and when I was a kid, I felt this way. I think a lot of kids feel that school's something that they have to do, almost like a prison sentence. It's not something I don't think is natural for kids to sit in desks and be told what to do for hours and hours on end. I know when I was in school, the classes that I did enjoy was metalwork, auto mechanics, woodwork, physical education. When we were doing dissections in biology and I could actually open something up and learn, but things like history and English and literature and home economics and things like those things just it felt like I was having to have my panty line waxed or something. It was just like I couldn't stop my mind from just wishing it was somewhere else. And I think part of the problem is nobody really ever showed how does learning this actually enhance your life, or how would learning this make it easier to make a better living? I think especially when kids get to high school level, they start thinking about, having enough money to have some freedom in their life. And if they can't see the direct connection from, studying something like philosophy or history and how that's actually going to enhance their ability to get the things they want in life, then it's hard for them to stay motivated. I think especially for males, because we're outwardly driven. We want to go conquer and, experience and explore and accomplish something. So I think my point is that I think where the education system is not doing young people a favor is that it's not helping them feel the connection between where they personally might want to go and how this education will help them. As a therapist, I teach my students a methodology. First, you have to identify what your client's dream is. What is it? Why is it that they came to you? What do they want to accomplish? Is it because they're in pain? Is it because they want to, perform better athletically? You've always got to identify what their dream goal or objective is. Then you have to tell them what they want to hear and give them what they need. What they want to hear is why this specific diet or lifestyle change or exercise approach or mobilization helps them get to that dream. And so that's, you got to give them what they need. What does the evaluation say? This person's lacking flexibility, or this person's got poor motor skills, or this person doesn't understand diet at all. So giving them what they need is that, but telling them what they want to hear is, how does changing your diet and not eating so much processed food enhance your athletic performance? Because most people can't make the connection. A lot of people, for example, think that food is no different than gasoline. You just shop for the cheapest stuff because it's nothing but energy, which is as far from the truth as you could get. So the point I'm making is that I think the education system needs to be more conscious of what it is that people's dreams are and goals are, analyze what it is that they need in order to get there relative to where they're at, and then tell the kids what they want to hear, which is how do you connect the dots between this class, this process, and your dream and achieving your goal. And I think we'd have a lot more conscious presence in students and interest in education, as opposed to it just being somewhere your parents ship you off to get rid of you so they can make a living.
Yeah, no, that's, and it's tricky because there's a couple of things here. The first is, when we think about modern education, it is an anomaly in the context of how education was done historically, right? So historically, education was a privilege. You had to be wealthy, and that's you got to go to school if you were from a wealthy family. And so, when we think about how dramatically we've changed, how many percentage of society we try to educate, and then try to think about how do you possibly communicate the value of that education to every single one of those students, given how diverse their own life experiences are and their own family backgrounds are, and what their individual dreams are. I think that's it's hard, right? Like figuring out, and because you might be able to articulate the value of learning some particular scientific concept to somebody who wants to go into maybe they want to go and do some engineering job, and that's what they can conceptualize right now, versus somebody who wants to grow up to write poems, and trying to figure out how to talk to every single one of those students at scale when with the size of our classrooms and the size of our schools. I think it is what is needed, but it is also an enormous undertaking and challenge that I don't think we fully figured out as a society how to actually do.
I think if I could interject, I would say, one, we use questionnaires, and two, that's what AI is good at. Give it the data and let it sift through it.
Right.
I mean, if we're going to use AI, let's use it intelligently.
Yeah.
And, AI could then put together a report and say, okay, this child right here actually isn't probably very likely to do well in this class. They belong in this class over here. And I think if we actually put some effort into having an interest in what the child really wants and what their desires are, what their dreams, and for example, I've worked with many of the greatest athletes and sporting organizations and professional sports teams in the world. And I know that in Russia, at age 6, they start doing tests on the kids. And they already know when they're 6, this kid right here has all the right stuff to be a top-ranked hockey player. This one, volleyball player. This one, shot putter. So they already actually know what the kid's genetics are, what their body shapes and types and natural abilities are, what their cognitive abilities, what their creative abilities, because they actually look into the stuff. And then they take the kids and put them into programs where they're likely to be successful because they're starting off with the right stuff. And I think that's hugely missing in education worldwide.
Yeah. I am, when you think about this was the other thing that I was thinking about, was that there is a level of exploring and broadening of your horizon that education can do that I think limiting it too early can also be a problem, right? So when you think about that, middle schooler who's demonstrating some interest in a particular area, you also want to think about what have they been exposed to in terms of different options to even know whether or not those other things are a possibility for them or something that they're interested in or something that they're good at. And that's where I think the education is a tricky role, because there's of course this catering to their own interest that you want to cater to a child's interest and make sure that they can see the value of what they're doing, because they're more likely to get something from that if they can see the value and not try to take shortcuts or whatever. But also, when they're that young, there is a level of basically paternalistic exposure that we need to do for our students, because they don't fully have the reasoning faculties yet to think through if I do this particular thing, it might not be something I enjoy right now, but it might give me an option to do something 15 years from now that would change my life, right? That kind of reasoning is not developed yet in most young children. And so figuring out developmentally, when do we decide that we're still going to have the kids try every single vegetable to decide which one they actually like, versus we're going to say okay, if you don't like vegetables, you don't have to eat them, right? That there is a very fine balance there of as an adult in the room, you have to say no, even if you don't like any vegetable, while you're young, we're still going to make you eat your vegetables before we give you the dessert. And there is probably something equivalent in education that we need to do, where it's like, even if you don't really enjoy this right now, and you can't see why this is important for your long-term fulfillment and happiness and safety and health. You're going to have to just put up with it for a little bit, and hopefully you will see the value of that in retrospect. And that's tough, because getting humans to do things when they're not fully bought in at any age is a very, very difficult thing, as any parent who's tried to get their kid to eat vegetables knows.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is, there's got to be some of both. And I think we have to use the knowledge that we have of the development of the brain and the psyche, the soul, at different stages, which is what Rudolf Steiner did extremely well. That's why I like the Waldorf school system. Have you studied Confucius at all?
Very little bit in high school. I don't know if I've done any Confucius I don't think I did anything since then with Confucius. Yeah.
Because his approach to education, which he was big on, and there's a fair bit in his teachings on education and the importance of it, and he had a lot to do with shaping the education in China. But he was to use your term, he was a eat your vegetables guy. But he basically mapped out the areas where he thought every young person had to have a foundational understanding of things like poetry and classics and art and in the various areas that he mapped out. But I think that it's really about what does it take to make a well-rounded human being, because if you don't have enough depth or breadth of knowledge, then your perceptual field is very, very narrow. You could be a genius at building, go-karts or rockets, but not know the difference between a tomato and a banana, which is not unrealistic, actually. I've worked with fighter jet pilots and all sorts of people. You'd think, how do you be that smart yet be this dumb with taking care of your own body? But it happens all the time. And I think so. I think these are just real issues that I'm glad you're talking about. I'm glad that we're talking about, because really the children are the future of humanity, and the problems that they're coming into the world to have to confront right now are of an order of magnitude that none of us adults have ever even fathomed.
Right.
And I won't even list them all because it would take half an hour just to put the list together. In your book, you argue that technology isn't neutral. I recently interviewed depth psychologist and tech expert Elizabeth Ewan Nelson, and she makes it clear that technology is not neutral. It shapes human thinking and behavior. From your perspective, how has the implementation of AI and digital ed tech shaped students' thinking and behavior for better or worse?
Millions of people are carrying parasites, and most don't even know it. In fact, the chances are good that you have one or more parasites inside you right now, leeching off your nutrients and strength. But before you get all freaked out about it, here is some good news. Organifi's Parasite Cleanse Kit contains a unique and specialized blend of carefully chosen natural elements that help locate, kill, and remove unwanted guests and pests from the body. Like a magnet finding iron in the sand, these ingredients adhere to the toxins and parasites and pull them out of hiding, ultimately removing them from your body. This two-step combination of 100% natural ingredients includes the Parasite Cleanse capsules and the Bind and Restore tincture, creating an easy-to-use cleanse that is perfect to help get rid of your unwanted guests. Now is a great time to try Organifi's Parasite Cleanse Kit and save 20%. Go to Organifi.com/Chek20 and use the promo code Chek20. That's Organifi.com/CHEK20 and use the code Chek20 for a 20% discount.
Gosh, there's probably different, roads we can go down here. I will say one of the biggest challenges of using technology in education and how that changes how students view what learning is and what thinking is technology and technology companies are obsessed with removing friction, right? They're all about efficiency. The idea is how can we make this thing happen faster and more easily for you? And that's not where learning often happens, right? Like it is that productive friction, productive struggle, where you actually gain some sort of knowledge or you gain a new skill set is by struggling. And so the more that we embrace the kind of technologies that send the message that like, oh, every single gain in efficiency is worth it or is good, I do think that changes the way students approach learning as a whole. And a very simple example for this might be, there's all these like new AI flashcard generators that are coming out that take your notes in your textbook and they create flashcards for you. And anybody who's like been in the classroom knows that for a student, making the flashcards is actually not not a obstacle, right? Like that is not the part that
no, it's part of the learning process.
It's where most of the learning takes place, figuring out exactly what you're going to make a flashcard about, figuring out what's going to go on the front and go on the back. Like that is those are all learning moments. And
can I just share one thing
absolutely.
there? You know, manifestation goes from thought to word to deed.
Yeah.
So you take it from intellect, cognitive brain, word. I'm often talking to myself while I'm reading and thinking, okay, what about this? Or, like I'm having a conversation either with the author or with myself or, but the action of word, when we write it or say it, we're wording, but the act of writing is the physical. So now it takes it all the way down into the motor system because your whole motor system's involved in writing. And I think what's happening is a lot of the technology is cutting off how the roots of knowledge grow into the body and leaving it at this very ephemeral, heady, intellectual idea level. And so you end up getting a bunch of cut and paste PhD type people that really haven't gotten their feet wet or their hands dirty in anything. And I think that's a very, very dangerous kind of side effect, like a drug side effect of the tech industry, is that they're railroading people into the illusion of actual learning and the illusion of knowledge.
Right. Yeah, and part of that, part of the narrative is also, and this is also changes behavior among students, but also educators, is that the more access you have to technology, the less you have to do yourself, I think is part of the narrative that I also think shapes behavior that is also very dangerous, right? I think the idea that why do they need to know that if they can always look it up on their phone? Like that is the value of knowledge is not only in your ability to recall it when someone asks you a very precise question. So yeah, someone's like, when did the Declaration of Independence get signed? And you can look it up on your phone, fine. Like that's not why you store that fact, right? You're learning those things because they're actually shaping how you think about other things down the road. And that kind of trickle effect, for some reason, folks act like it doesn't happen. And knowledge is no longer important because it's at your fingertips. But those kinds of narratives, I think, are really dangerous because I think students buy into it. And I think sometimes we end up going along with it in education because it's so predominantly part of the narrative. And that's also dangerous. I think we're shortchanging our students when we do that.
Well, I think one of the distinctions that needs to be made is that people are making the distinction. They're not making the distinction between information and knowledge.
Yeah.
AI and phones can give you lots of information, but knowledge is a process that only happens through the challenges of trial and error and making mistakes and figuring out what works. You can ask AI how to grow a garden, and it might tell you plant such and such seeds. But until you actually go out and plant it in the soil and water it every day and realize, oh my God, it never told me about all these worms and the fact that the birds are going to eat all this.
Right.
That's how you get knowledge.
Right.
And I think we're really in a dangerous situation because we are not remembering that knowledge is an engagement process. It's something you have to be involved in.
Right.
And it blows my mind how many people are being given master's degrees and PhDs for what is really just the capacity to memorize a bunch of information. But I know, for example, physical therapists that spent 4 years in school to be a physical therapist and hardly touched a single body. They've removed cadaver dissections out of medical schools now, so doctors study anatomy on computer screens. Having done 5 cadaver dissections myself, I can tell you, you don't learn anatomy on a computer screen. You got to touch it. You got to actually look behind things. You need 3 dimensions of interaction, or your understanding of anatomy is very, very dangerous, really. It's an illusion. So anyhow, I bring these things up because I think these are the things that are important. And I think I get the sense that some of what you're trying to address with your book, because if you're really into the science of learning, then we have to really get clear on what learning is. And I think the tech companies are actually brainwashing people out of understanding the learning process for profit.
Right.
And
that's exactly it.
That's scary.
It is scary. It is really scary. And I think that again is, I think, largely what motivates a lot of the work I do these days is that in order for us to actually serve our students, we can't let the tech companies set the terms of the conversation, right? I think we need to be able to have these conversations amongst people who actually care about these issues, and largely that will be educators and parents who can sit down and say, okay, like this is what we want for our students, and then how do we get there? Not, hey, here's this tool that gets you somewhere that we think is important for you to get because that makes us money, right? Those are very different conversations, and I do think we're stuck right now in the letting the tech companies kind of tell you something is important while they're doing a sales pitch to you at the same time.
Aren't you a bit concerned about the power that tech companies are starting to have over every aspect of our life?
I am. And, that's not even limited to education. I think that
I'm talking about all of it. Food production, politics, manufacturing. I got to tell you a funny story. You're going to probably get a chuckle out of this one. I was developing a new lesson plan and a slideshow, and I needed to make a diagram, and I kept trying to use what's it called? I don't remember. Midjourney, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I find that thing a pain in the bloody ass. It doesn't follow my directions at all, and I have to go through over and over. So I found, okay, I'm going to get Claude to start giving it cues, and then it works better. It's still got problems, but it works better. So anyhow, I'm using Midjourney because it was recommended to me, and sometimes it takes me 3 hours to get one useful image out of the damn thing. And so there was something it couldn't do. And so Claude said, I can do that for you. And it was a simple diagram I was making called the 5 qualities of the soul. And I just put a label on each finger and then the thumb and a little tiny kind of graphic above. I mean, I could have drawn it up by hand in, 30 minutes, easy. It wouldn't look like my professional artist. I was just trying to avoid the time because I have a full-time professional artist that I work with, and I have to go back and forth with her because she's in Sweden. And so Claude said it could do that. Well, I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, and Claude crashes like 4 times, and I'm like, I finally stopped it and said, what in the world's going on? I mean, this is just a simple diagram. And so Claude tells me, oh, actually, it's a lot harder because the AI's ability to actually take shapes like that and make them isn't very well developed yet, which is why you might see things on Midjourney where someone's got an extra finger or something like that. And so I said to Claude, I said, well, how is it that Disney just laid off something like 1,700 of their top cartoon and movie artists, saying that AI was going to do their jobs more effectively? And Claude wrote me back and said, that's just a cover up for them trying to save money. It's going to be years before AI could ever replace this artist with that level of skill. And Claude says, just wait, it won't be long and they'll all be getting their jobs back.
Yeah.
I said, there's some truth from Claude.
Yeah, and we see lots of folks. I think Anthropic, which is the company behind Claude, is hiring like a chief of copywriting that they're paying like a good sum of money to. And while other companies are saying, "Oh, we don't need our copywriters anymore because Claude can do it." So it's interesting to see the value of like the precision and the value of like human generated content. I think will continue to have a premium, and I think anybody who thinks otherwise is there's a short-term transition phase where folks will think it's amazing, and then they'll set in, some reality will set in, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I'm already seeing, I just saw a post on Instagram where a bunch of people got together and they're starting sort of like a restaurant, and it's all about just coming to have the experience of touching things and hearing music, and they're calling it the analog experience because people are getting so digitally disgusted that now they want to really embrace the analog reality. And I'm like, yeah, baby, that's why I have a very expensive stereo, not a bunch of digital bullshit, Yeah. But anyhow, it's fun to have these conversations with you because I think these are important things people are not thinking about. I recently had Jared Cooney Horvath, the author of The Digital Delusion, on my podcast. We had a very important dialogue. And one of the things that he shared was a summary of the research emerging now that shows that the more time kids spend on screens and using AI, the worse their intellectual performance becomes, and what it means to be educated, as well as a number of other influences, such as loss of agency and creativity, is changing for the worse. Based on the research I've done, your position on the use of AI has changed since you wrote the book AI and the Future of Education, Teaching in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Now that you've had enough time to see the effects of AI and digital tech, where do you stand regarding AI and the overall effects of digital technology on a student's actual education, and how does it relate to the students themselves? I mean, we've been touching on some of these things, but you must be watching all this stuff and you're educated, like you know what you're looking at. How do you do you go to school boards and say, hey, maybe you're making a mistake here? Do you talk to the tech companies and say, hey, you guys are selling us a pipe dream? Or do you just roll over and watch it happen?
So I think, I think the most important thing is that I think that there is no one size fits all approach for education. And I think that this is where a lot of the conversation on technology and education has kind of always, like, especially the last few years, been this little pendulum of, you'll see schools say, okay, like, we're going to ban all of this. We're not going to talk about it. We're going to stick to what we always do. And then you see other schools are like, well, here's an AI tutor for 4 hours a day. We're really excited about this technology. We're going to use it in every way possible. And I think what the reality is that there probably are good use cases of the technology. Like, I still do not think that it is there is nothing to be gained by the tech. I will and I can give you some examples of where I think that might be the case. But I think what we're missing is the nuance of figuring out what is right for our particular students and allowing teachers to make those decisions themselves, rather than trying to figure out like some state level policy or even school level policy. Because at the end of the day, the use of technology, if it's done precisely and with intention, is very different than if it's done as this like a blunt sword versus a sharp one, I guess. The example here, let me make some examples will make that a little bit more clear. I'm thinking of, for example, if you gave every single student a AI writing coach and said, okay, like, you can use this and go home, and this will if you use ChatGPT, it will help you become a better writer, so we're going to give you your free school account. The chances that an average student goes home and uses that in a productive way is very low, right? Yeah. It is extremely, extremely low because of the incentive structures we've set up in education and human nature of, if the goal is a finished product and that's what you're going to be judged on, then any path to the finished product is going to seem legitimate. But if there's a student who understands the value of the writing process and they go home and use ChatGPT, they could use it to become a better writer. There is a way to do that, right? It is not that it plays no role in making learning possible or better. And I think that that's the problem, is that right now there's this like we have this narrative from tech companies, and that focuses so heavily on here are all the things that the tech can do. And I think a lot of educators are slowing down and saying, okay, even if that can be done, it's not exactly what will happen, right? And that can versus will distinction, I think, is really important when you think about what role the technology can play or should play in our classrooms. And so I think that largely what we need to figure out is which students are actually going to benefit from the technology. And so another domain you might want to think about is like accessibility purposes, right? So if a student has a particular learning need and they can use a technology tool in order to like streamline that process, that might be a use case of the technology that's really good. And so a simple example might be, somebody who's hard of hearing and is in a classroom that's largely vocal. If they have, an AI tool that can transcribe what the teacher and all of their peers are saying, that's a really good use case of the technology to make our classroom more accessible to that student, right? Like they can now sit in that classroom and not necessarily need to be in a separate classroom setting. And that is really powerful. And AI makes that possible in a way that it really wasn't possible a few years ago. But if we say, okay, like everybody is going to only read a transcript of their teacher talking that's generated by AI, we might say that's a problem, right? Like that is not exactly the right solution for every single student sitting in our classroom. And so it's really that nuance of figuring out when is the use of technology serving a very particular human need that we have in education versus when are we using it because it seems like the easiest option or because it seems like the coolest option, quote unquote, because of the larger narrative. Yeah.
One of the areas that I've seen AI be quite useful, I have two wives, Angie and Penny, and I have three kids. One's 46, but he's got a son so I have a 5-year-old grandson, but I have two younger ones at home from my marriage to Angie, and Mana's 10 and Zoe's just turning 7 here shortly. And Angie, Penny, and the kids both love these language training models, and they're studying language all the time, and it's like a game, and they're always competing against other people, and it's really cool. But the point I'm bringing up is, like, it'll ask them a question. How do you tell this person how to open the door in Spanish or whatever? And then they'll say it and it'll correct them. It'll tell them if it's wrong, or it'll say something to them. Somebody says, pull your car into the garage and we're going to do a tune-up. And then they have to repeat back what they just heard that person say. So I like that because then the AI is actually giving them feedback on whether or not they're learning the language or not, what mistakes they're making in pronunciation. And so that's something I see as useful like that, because it's pretty much what you would be doing with a language teacher anyhow. You just have a human being sitting there telling you words that you would say, and you'd say them back and they would correct you. I think that's an effective use of AI right there. And I like for kids that they make it more fun because they can see by getting points how everybody else is doing. I mean, my kids are always trying to get more points to either beat each other or beat the other people. So it's kind of really making that sort of education fun for them. And so there's an example where I think these technologies can actually be quite good.
Right. And I think that's a really good example because the use of AI could also, somebody might say, why learn the language at all? Put on your little AirPods and go walk outside and it will do the translation for you. And that I think that folks who have learned a second language and have interacted with somebody who speaks that language know that there's a very big difference between a human to human communication in someone's native tongue versus like a mediated conversation through technology. But being able to see the intrinsic value of learning the language is what makes it possible for your family to use it in a productive way, right? Because they are motivated to use it in a productive way because they actually want to learn the language. And so then they can use the possibilities and power of the technology. It's getting those folks who don't, if they have Spanish as a required class for them and they don't really understand why they would need to take it or something. And then they're given these tools. Are they going to gain the same thing or not? I don't think they would. And that's the challenge I think we have is there's some really cool things that the technology can do. And that would be really helpful and powerful. How do we get folks to use it in those ways and not the ones that are going to be, take away their humanity or their ability to learn, I think is a big challenge.
Yeah, I think I imagine people can just search the internet, but it would be interesting to know what are the available education technologies, and where do you find them? Like when I used to be a mechanic, are you familiar with Snap-on tools?
I am not.
Snap-on's a famous company that makes really top-notch tools, but there's a few different Craftsman and other companies, and they have these great big trucks that are loaded with tools, and they go around from mechanic shop to mechanic shop. And if you need a special tool, say you're working on a 1980s Mustang, and it's very hard to get the spark plugs out. They'll have tools custom designed for these odd jobs. And so it always used to be fun when the Snap-on guy would come around, because he would tell us about all the new tools they made. And then we would realize, if I had that tool, my life would be a lot easier. It could make my job go quicker. So it'd be fun if they had like the tool truck version where kids could, like you go out to the ice cream truck and you say, what flavors have you got? You'd say, well, we've got this for language learning. We've got this for cooking. We've got... I think it might be fun for people to actually, that might make a great TV show, actually, just where people can learn about all the different technologies there are and what to use. Because my sense is there's a lot of decent technology out there that people just don't know about.
Yeah, and I think new things pop up every day, especially in the last few years, that use the technology in new and innovative ways. It is hard because being able to vet a technology tool is also a very particular skill set, right? Like figuring out, for example, there's a difference between gamified engagement and learning engagement, right? So like those engagement tactics that, the point system, for example, can be good representation sometimes of the learning that takes place. Sometimes it doesn't mean much. And so there's some data that like some of these language learning apps, while, people are progressing through all of these different levels and they're getting all these different badges, and then they put them in a real room with a real person and they can barely say anything.
They can't speak the language.
Exactly. And so, but they've been optimizing for their points and their badges. And so like this is where like we, building some basic literacy about like how learning happens and how to even know whether or not you're learning, and testing that learning properly, and then finding an app that fits that need is more important than necessarily finding it right away. Because you're right, an internet search for these things will turn up lots of different options. It's about being able to figure out the right one that I think is tricky.
I think you got a great opportunity for a TV show there, a podcast that focuses on all this stuff. So people can go talk to Priten and say, hey, what do I do?
Yeah, have some open office hours for technology options for your home.
Yeah, and you might make a lot of money testing this stuff, giving your kind of like consumer reports for technology. I think you're the guy, man. You got the right background.
There are some really good options, especially for teachers. There's lots of projects that do some of this vetting and help them kind of navigate which tools are safe and good. And so, but I have not yet seen one that's geared towards a non-teacher who wants to find a learning tool. So definitely an audience and a need there, maybe.
Yeah. Well, good. We'll meditate on it.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I imagine you know that magnesium is one of the minerals that people in North America are the most deficient in, but it's an extremely important mineral to have in your diet regularly. And believe it or not, Bioptimizers has improved what was already well known to be the best magnesium formula out there, called Magnesium Breakthrough. So I've got Wade Lightheart with me to explain what it is they've done to improve this already excellent formula. Wade, what is new about your new Mag Breakthrough formula?
Well, it's called sucrosomial magnesium. So we have 7 different types of magnesium in Magnesium Breakthrough because they're uptaken by different parts of the body. But a new type of magnesium has been created called sucrosomial. And what it shows in the research and science is that it's actually even more absorbable by the body, particularly inside of the brain, which is a big aspect to enhance neurotransmitter formation, as well as ensuring the rest and relax response in the nervous system that a lot of people will take magnesium for. They find it, clocks them down, helps them sleep better, allows for the relaxation of striated and smooth muscle tissue in the body, which creates an energetic relief. And so when we added sucrosomial, we were able to demonstrate inside our lab facility that we were able to get better improvements. Of course, we have a partnership with Birch International University. We have some patents we're working on, which will kind of relay some of these things. But sucrosomial was a no-brainer when we added to the formula, improved the results or improved the uptake. And the reports back from our testing team were like, wow, we get more results with less caps. And that's always the goal for our company.
That's excellent. I love it. I always say, and people have probably heard me say it before, I'm so amazed how you guys are constantly and always improving and working your best to not only make better products for us, but it doesn't seem to me that it gets more expensive as you make them better. So that's a real gift to the world. Thank you.
Spirit Gym with Paul Chek listeners now get 15% off their purchase of Probiotic Breakthrough by going to bioptimizers.com/Spirit Gym and use the code PAUL15 at checkout. You can choose from 3 different sizes, and in addition, Bioptimizers always have special bonus gifts and additional savings when you get multiple bottles. So head to bioptimizers.com/Spirit Gym and check out Probiotic Breakthrough with the code PAUL15 for 15% off.
One of my concerns as a parent and an educator is that AI and digital ed tech are a moving target. The technology changes so fast, and therefore the way people are educated with technology changes fast. Just as we're forever getting computer and phone updates that can leave you wondering, how do I use this app or program now? It's not the same. In dealing with bugs in tech, it seems that we're being distracted with gadgets while losing focus on the essentials of education. A case in point, when I was a soldier in electronics school, we had to do a lot of math every day to design electronic circuits, solve problems, and truly understand what was happening within the equipment we were using. We were not allowed to use calculators. We were told that if your calculator or your equipment gets destroyed in a battlefield, you still have to know how to do your work or the shit hits the fan. I used to repair weapon systems on Cobra helicopters. So if I lose a computer that analyzes electronics for me, I better know how to do it or we're going down, simple. So this is the opposite of tech dependency and the essence of true education. I see that I don't see this happening in schools that have adopted AI and digital technology at all. In fact, most people today would be totally lost on some level without their iPhones. And I know that's a fact. So I'm concerned about this, and I want to know what your thoughts are in this regard.
Yeah, I think I share your concerns. I think that the dependency on the technology, I think, is a problem, and I think some examples you've given, but both examples you've given are, I think, relevant. Right? When you think about like what happens if that technology fails or goes away in a high stakes scenario, I think is a great example of thinking through like how easily we let ourselves become dependent on this, and what risks that opens us up to. The other part of this is I think there's something you miss, not only in like the performance of a particular skill set, but in terms of how you view the world when you offload some of that and become dependent on the technology. And so an example that I often give is like the less and less we focus on math as a permanent life skill, right? Most folks now turn to their calculator to do very basic arithmetic. And that's representative of a larger deterioration of math skills, I think. But I think that means that we've lost something in terms of when you walk into a room and you're able to like, there's a mathematical like intuition that I think that kicks in when you have learned formal mathematics that you lose when you've offloaded all of that mathematical thinking. Same thing with spatial reasoning. By using GPSs all the time, we have lost our ability to like go into a new city and actually like appreciate the city in a very particular way because you're constantly navigating it with your GPS. Which is not, it's not necessarily, oh my gosh, what happens if you don't have your iPhone and you're dropped in the middle of Madrid, right? Like that's not necessarily even what I'm concerned about, but you're losing something about your experience of being in Madrid by completely offloading that experience of figuring out the layout of the city and exactly how things are arranged. And there is something about the history of the layout that also is worthy of knowing if you're traveling there. And that's, it's a very particular example, but I think those are cases where it's not necessarily even the immediate loss of the skill set that's scary, but it's also like we're losing something human about our way to understand the world when we offload some of our thinking and our being to the technology tools.
Well, just imagine if you were in a survival situation out in the wilderness and you had no food, and the only way you could decide what to eat was to take pictures of it and ask AI what's safe to eat, but then your batteries die. Well, you're probably going to die too, because the chances of you eating something poisonous are really high.
Right. Yeah,
so you can't, shall we say, give that skill to a phone. I think parents and educators need to actually start categorizing what skills are fundamental that have to be built and free of technology. Right. Like finding your way home.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the challenges we have ahead of us, I think, because so much of the narrative right now is that if a tech tool can do it, we don't need our children to do it. And that is a very frustrating and saddening argument. But I hear it often. It's often, why are schools and teachers still trying to get our kids to do things that technology can do for them? Well, there is a very big difference between your child doing it and the technology doing it. And there's value to your child learning how to do it. And for some reason, I think we're really struggling right now to communicate that. But I think it's also largely because we've convinced ourselves that, like, as long as we have a tech tool with us and it can do it, we're not losing anything. And I think getting folks to kind of slow down and realize what you're losing, whether it be the risks of what happens when the technology isn't there, but also what it means for how you conduct yourself in the world. I think those are things we need to figure out how to slow down and get folks to see.
Well, just as an analogy, if you come to the conclusion AI can do art for me, so I don't need to do art anymore, well, guess what? You're not an artist anymore. You just gave it all away. Right. It's the process, it's the engagement. I mean, I could go on, but I really think that we're in some tricky situations right now, because if you ask yourself a simple question, what's going to happen 10 years from now if we keep playing these, the tech can do it for you so you don't have to learn it anymore games? I mean, if you look at the way people are playing around with dangerous military weapons and every other damn thing, and how many wars are going on, I mean, it's so easy for you to end up in a situation with no technology when your life's hanging in the bloody breeze, but you're just completely useless because you don't have your battery-operated gadgets to tell you how to do everything. It's a scary, as a parent, for me, it's like very concerning. Yeah. I'm watching parents lose their own ability to think like a parent, which is problematic.
Right. Yeah. When you think using the technology to navigate interpersonal relationships is definitely a really interesting one, where if you're every time, if you have a conflict with your child, you're trying to convince them of something, or you turn to the tech tools. I think there's something you're losing there, and you're not building that intuition yourself, which I think is important in terms of getting to know your child. But there's also, if every time your kid is if every time your child is sick, you're able to get faster advice on the illness, like that might be a benefit of the technology, right? Especially if you're in a rural area where the nearest hospital is far away or the nearest doctor is far away. Like having an AI tool that can tell you, okay, like this, you don't need to rush to the emergency room, just give the child some ibuprofen and they'll be fine, is probably worth it. But if you're asking them about every single emotional development the child is having, you're probably losing something in terms of knowing your child. And so it is tricky.
There is a lot of gray areas in there. I think it's something fantastic, because pretty soon we're going to come to the realization we actually have to get involved. Yeah. That's the reality of it. There's going to be cases that will be strong enough where people get caught blindsided, and they'll serve as, what do you call it? Like warning signs. If you're not careful, this could be you. So pay attention. Your book contains 12 case studies covering the following specific problem domains: student privacy and data collection, AI implementation in instruction, grading, and assessment, equitable access or its absence, social media policies in schools, biometric sensors, and immersive virtual reality entering classrooms, stakeholder dynamics, who gets to decide what comes into the building. Could you please share why these specific domains are the basis of your book and why you feel we should be aware, we should be aware of regarding each of these specific domains?
Yeah, so the case studies in the book were chosen largely based on conversations with teachers and faculty members across the country in terms of actual complicated scenarios that they were facing in their schools. And obviously, they're fictionalized and sometimes they're combined across different schools, and sometimes there's a news story mixed in as well in terms of what the background was for each case study. But at the end of the day, the case studies were really chosen to kind of illustrate different types of complications that might come up in an ethical decision-making scenario.
Right.
And specifically ones that an individual teacher would have to face, just because that was the target audience for the book. And I think that the most important thing actually about the case studies, more so than the actual the content of any of them, because as you notice, I don't give an answer to any of them. I don't say, okay, this is exactly what the teacher should do at the end of this case study, because at the end of the day, and this came up early on, my goal is to build a capacity to think about these things, not necessarily tell people what to think about them. And so the case studies are chosen because they allow you to kind of practice the kind of ethical reasoning skills that I try to build in the first part of the book, of how do you apply a framework, how do you ensure that you're consulting with all the right people, your student voice is incorporated, the parent voice is incorporated, which voices are not being heard. And the case studies are written to kind of bring all those concerns out so that teachers can kind of practice that, and they can figure out, if this was a real scenario, how might I do it? The other thing with this is the case studies are nice because when you have a real decision in front of you, it's often loaded, and you have, if it's a real decision your school is facing, you already have a gut intuition. That someone else is advocating for it, and you don't know how you feel about that person, and maybe that makes you disagree with the decision right away. And so I like the case studies as a practice scenario because that allows folks to kind of think about this in a emotionally neutral way, where it's not their actual school, it's not actual people that they have pre-existing thoughts towards, and then they can practice that particular skill set. But there's maybe the couple of the case studies that I think are the most important. I do think there's one on detection tools that is really, really important, because that's a debate that comes up almost in every single school and university right now, which is, what do we do about students who are writing with AI? And then how much of a role should the AI detection systems play in those situations? And I think that there's a lot of ethical questions that come up there because the AI detection tools are not very accurate. There's tons of times where they give you false negatives and false positives. And so what does that mean for whether or not you use them? What does that mean for take home assignments where students are having to do anything outside of, being watched by faculty members? And so then how do you build policies? Do you just say, we're not going to give any more homework ever again? Do you say that if the AI detector says it's 99% likely to be AI, we're going to still penalize you, even though there's a 1% chance that you might have written it yourself? Figuring that out is really complicated. And so the case study kind of breaks down all those different factors and how kind of poses that question to the educator so they can apply the framework to come up with the decision that's right for their school.
You put a lot of thought into this book. How long did it take you to really understand what ingredients needed to be in it? Because you've clearly put a lot of depth of thinking and looked at a lot of scenarios to write the book. I just want to say great job on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think the long and complicated answer is that I think that this book was actually a result of probably the last 15 years of my work. And I think that that's where I think I mentioned this a little bit in the preface, where I talk about all the various experiences and projects that I've worked on that end up coming out in the book in various different ways. And so I am really proud of this one. It really does feel like it's me in the most comprehensive sense of kind of integrating all of those different experiences that I've had and gotten a chance to talk to a lot of different people through and kind of, think about these different issues through. But there's papers in there that I cite that I read as a sophomore in college. There's books in there that I read as a high schooler. Some of these case studies are from a random conference I read. Like it is a pretty wide array of different experiences that kind of end up influencing the contents of the book.
Okay, so did you basically give us the overview of those areas I just outlined?
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that anybody who's interested, and that I have parent specific case studies that we're putting out soon too for ethical decisions that parents might have to make about the technology. And so for folks on the who are listening who are not educators, that might actually be of more interest, which is why I think the book kind of stands as three separate sections really. And half the book is the philosophy section that I think applies to anybody. And then there's this practice section, which allows, folks to kind of use those things those skill sets that I'm trying to build. Because a bunch of knowledge, if you can't do anything with it, is a waste of my time writing the book and the reader's time,
right?
Having read it, and so that's really the role that plays. And so there's specific case studies for different audiences that I also put out.
Yes, I'm quite concerned about the influence AI and tech companies are having not only on education but a vast array of industries, not to mention the environment. In my dialogue with Jared Harvath regarding the digital delusion, he made it clear that it is not teachers forming the curriculums, but people that have no teaching experience at all. How are tech corporations infiltrating the education systems without any objective evidence that their technology promises are valid? And why are the administrators of educational institutions worldwide allowing this to happen? It seems like we have the same problem in education that we have in government, and with the same results.
Big question. In a really
you're a smart guy.
So I think that there's the human part of this that I'll start with, because I think while I am critical of how much we have allowed the tech companies to infiltrate the conversations in our schools, I can sympathize with folks who find themselves giving into that because it's a pretty scary time, right? The pace of technology development is really fast. I think a lot of folks most of us don't really understand exactly what's coming next and what exactly has already happened. And I think when you're facing that much ambiguity, somebody who comes in and acts like they have all the answers, there is an appeal to that I think is very human, right? I think when you're scared and someone comes in and says, "Hey, well, here's the right answer," and I know what I'm talking about because I'm the one who built the technology. I think it makes sense that there's some deference to those people. But I think I agree that it's dangerous because these folks have a very particular agenda in mind. We talked a little bit about that earlier, so I won't repeat the section of the efficiency and all those different kinds of things that I think a tech company prioritizes that an individual educator might not. But this is also the bedrock of my work these days, is helping schools kind of reclaim that conversation, build the right vocabulary, figure out exactly what they want for their students, and then try to figure out decision making rather than letting external companies come in and make those decisions. I think part of the reason why this has all been so appealing historically, even pre-AI, is I think that we're so fixated on measuring our schools. And I think we're so fixated on trying to control every single aspect of our schooling across the country that I think these kinds of dramatic solutions oftentimes feel like the easiest way to do that. And so when you think about curriculum, for example, we let sometimes random people, write the curriculum for what goes into our schools because they come in and say, okay, well, we're going to sell this curriculum to every single school across the country. And so then every single school across the country every student across the country is learning the same thing. And I think that removes so much of the humanity of a classroom, right? There is so much professional judgment that an educator could bring to that scenario that is being lost. There's also, we like to measure things. And again, we want to make sure that the schools that we're sending our students to and our children to are good, right? That obviously, again, a very human intuition to say, is this school a good school or not? But unfortunately, sometimes the kinds of learning that you and I were just talking about, it's really hard to measure that in a concrete way. And so then we find ourselves trying to measure whatever we can. And oftentimes that's like these reading comprehension tests and these math tests that really kind of narrowly focus on what the schooling should be about in a way that takes away a lot of the meat of it. And then everything becomes about those test scores. And I think that that's another problem that we've definitely had in terms of our education system, is that we've become so fixated on these like very particular measurements because they're the easiest things to measure, that I think we're sacrificing a lot of the other important developmental work that happens in a school. And that, that's sad. And then I think we're starting to see some of the impacts of that. Like, I think reading is a prime example where a reading comprehension test was built to test the student's ability to whether or not they had learned how to read in a larger context. And we've become so fixated on getting those reading scores up that most schools these days don't really, require students to read full books. And so they, especially in the middle school and high school years, where you're reading little passages because that's what the test will have. And then you're trying to answer those questions because we're just trying to ace the test rather than actually teach them how to read. And so it kind of got backwards, where the test became the focus rather than a measure of the actual learning that would happen. And that's all, I think, dangerous. And I think we're starting to see the impact of students who have, don't have a habit of reading properly, and then they end up going to college and they haven't like they're not reading there anymore either. And then those people are going out in the world and trying to figure out everything without having a capacity to read a book.
Yeah, one of the things I'm picking up from our dialogue here, and just from my own observations, is that one of the risks we're facing with all this tech and test-oriented outcomes is the diversity of learning that makes, it's like what makes nature strong is diversity, not uniformity. Once you start monocropping anything, you're destabilizing nature. You're actually decreasing your chances of survival. If you get an environmental crisis, you're less likely to get through it. And I think that the technology is almost kind of creating a uniformity on the way people read and the way they're tested. And so with that sort of mindset, the same educators that are ushering that in are actually losing their own ability to look for what the nuances that make an intelligent child, even if they didn't get a high score on the test. Because I can tell you right now, there's more millionaires that did not graduate from high school than there are that did. That's been researched. And so most of these guys had minds that just did not fit the standard model, but it didn't mean they were dumb at all. And so I think that we're here's another gray area that's potentially dangerous.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think this is where figuring out how we can figure out what we want out of education more concretely, and the answer not be standard. And it isn't standard. No one is going to tell you that what we actually want out of schooling is high test scores, right? Like, we just have adopted that as the easiest thing to measure. And we've been told that funding is dependent on it, and whether or not teachers are hired or fired is dependent on it, right? And whether or not your child, if someone sends their child to your school, is dependent on it. And so there is a high level of focus on those test scores. But at the end of the day, like, most people don't really think that's the most important part of the educational experience. And if we kind of can sit back and have those conversations, especially now when there's so many challenges coming up for education, we might come up with better answers that serve all of our students in more meaningful ways, rather than only, figure out how we can get our reading comprehension scores on little passages to be very, very high.
If you have listened to even one episode of Paul's podcast before, then you will know that he is passionate, and some would say even fanatical, about the quality of the food he eats and where it is sourced from. That is why the Chek household only eats pasture-raised meat, wild-caught fish, and organic produce. And that is why we subscribe to Wild Pasture's meat delivery service. Each month, Wild Pastures delivers a box of meat that has been raised by family farmers in the USA using regenerative farming practices. 100% grass-fed and finished beef, pasture-raised chicken, and pasture-raised pork, as well as wild-caught seafood. You can customize the selection in your box, add on extra when you know you will be feeding more people, or change your options each and every month. You might be thinking that this will be too expensive for you, but Wild Pasture's mission is to offer the highest quality meat at the lowest prices because they want to transform the meat industry. And that means that more people need to be able to choose meat that is raised right. Their pasture-raised animals are part of a natural ecosystem. Their farmers use rotational grazing, practices that mimic nature, and so do not need to use synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, or antibiotics. This beautiful process doesn't require the external resources, such as massive amounts of GMO grain, required with environmentally depleting conventional methods. And best of all, the meat and fish taste amazing. And for Paul's listeners, Wild Pastures are offering you 20% off your subscription for life, $15 off your first order, and free shipping. Seriously, you can't find a better deal for top quality pasture-raised meat. Go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek. You don't need a promo code. Just visit wildpastures.com/Paul Chek and start choosing the goodies you will have delivered to you in your first box.
I'll give you an example that came to mind as you were talking. I teach weightlifting as part of what my institute does, not only for general health, but for athletic performance. If my only test was how much you could lift, then there would be a number of people out there that would get very high test scores. But my job is to teach them how to do it so they can keep doing it and not get injured.
Right.
So if we have an AI system that just measures how much you lift, but doesn't tell you where you're making mistakes in your biomechanics and how you're going through there's three phases to every lift: the setup, the execution, and the follow through. If we don't look at how you're setting up and executing and following through, you might be so strong that you actually injure yourself. And so this is what happens when you're only focusing on an objective dimension. But to watch a person lift a weight, you have to have the ability to see a lot of things happening at once. And there's a feel to it. Like there's literally when a person's lifting a weight properly, they're in what I call the groove. And you can tell when someone's in the groove because no matter how much weight they're lifting, it looks relatively effortless because the whole body's working in harmony. So the whole body gets involved in the lift. But you get some dude in there with great big arms who just happens to have good genetics, who can lift a lot of weights, but has no core function and isn't using their back properly. And they can objectively lift a lot of weight, but from a skilled lifter's perspective, an educator's perspective, their days are very numbered lifting heavy objects because of the mistakes they're making. And I think that's just a metaphor for what's happening with technology right there and testing.
Yeah, and I'm going to take that metaphor one step further. And if you think about athletes in general, and you think about, for example, a swimmer, and you say, okay, like we want to figure out a way to like make sure that we put out the best swimmers in our schools. And one thing we've noticed is that swimmers have really well developed lats.
Right.
And so we're going to spend all of school developing our students doing lat pull downs. That's it.
It doesn't work.
And that's what they're going to be tested on. That's what we're going to practice all day long, and then hope that when they leave school, they're professionally competent swimmers. Like that is exactly what we're doing with education right now. When you think about what like this reading comprehension focus or the math focus on these very particular narrow skill sets, is we think that they represent something larger, but we're not actually teaching the larger thing anymore, and we're just focusing on that one minor part of it.
Well, you're a pretty smart guy to choose that example because it's actually a very good one. And just to show you how specificity is also involved, you can do lat pull downs all you want and get as strong as you want, but it rarely does anything to improve your chin up because a lat pull down is an open chain movement, which means you're overcoming the resistance. But with a chin up bar, you can't overcome the resistance. So the recruitment pathways are 180 degrees out of phase. Yeah. So if we don't look at specific nuances like that, in education, we can be smart people that are 180 degrees out of phase.
Yeah.
And that's called being out of touch with reality, which means you didn't get educated at all, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I'm great. It's great for me to actually talk to you and see you're actually a pretty damn smart guy.
Thank you. Well, this is a great
Congratulations.
conversation. It's a very engaging conversation. So I think I'm having a good time.
Well, we're getting to the meat and potatoes of it. That's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because I wanted to make sure people knew why they should read this book.
I appreciate that.
It seems that the core argument of ethical ed tech is that ethical technology in K through 12 the K2 requires community alignment across three domains: philosophy, what we value, and what we're unwilling to sacrifice, which is important; policy, the commitments and structures that hold us accountable; practice, where principles meet the reality of actual classrooms. Could you please expand on these three categories and share why your practice domain doesn't extend beyond the classroom into the world where education must be applied to be effective? As I see it, education isn't for the classroom. It's for helping students navigate and be successful at making a living and at living, period. And as you know, there was a time when nature, the actual vocation environment, was the classroom.
Yeah. So the philosophy, policy, practice framework actually aligns with kind of the journey that I was telling, and hence why this book is a representation, I think, of a lot of different of my experiences. But the reason I approach it that way is because I think, first and foremost, I think we need to have those conversations about our foundational values and which is what we've been actually doing today, right? We've been having conversations about what we want for our children, what we want education to look like. And that needs to be the starting place rather than this like wishy-washy thing that we all assume we're not going to talk about, or think that we've already figured it out, because we really haven't. We don't have a community consensus on what schools are for. And if you ask 5 random people on the street, you will get 5 different answers about what the purpose of schooling is. And we need to figure out what we actually want schools to do for our society if we're going to actually do it well, because we need a metric to judge it on. That's a shared one. The policy part of this is largely focused on figuring out how do we get, once you have those values and you've had conversations, figured, okay, like we want our students to lead meaningful lives where they feel like they have a purpose in the world, right? Like that might be one possible value that somebody might state about education, hopefully. You might have that, but you and I having that is not enough for that to be a long-standing thing in our schools. We need some sort of bedrock policies to make sure that outlives us, so that it's not just dependent on 1 or 2 people, but it's ingrained into the actual institution and infrastructure of the institution. When I then talk about practice, I am talking about how schools and teachers might implement those things in their practice in the classroom. But I think when we think about the role of the external world or the real world, and what the role that ought to play, that actually shows up much earlier than that practice stage. It shows up in the philosophy stage, and so that's where in the philosophy chapters of the book I talk about the stakes of education, and I talk about what do we actually want for our students once they're outside of our schools, and I think that's where that conversation actually takes place, well before we even get to like what do we do in our actual classroom, because then downstream it affects it. And so if you already decided that you want if you want a student to be able to sit at a Thanksgiving table and have a real conversation about an important topic, because that's what we value philosophically, then when you get to the practice stage and you figure out what you're going to do in your classroom, you're doing it in service of that.
Yes.
And that's where I think that we actually need to have the conversation about what practice in the real world looks like for our students at the philosophy level, and not necessarily just at the classroom practice level.
I think that's a very important thing you've just said. Extremely important. Something I find deeply concerning is the lack of awareness in education systems at large regarding the direct influence that factors such as diet, lifestyle, exercise, environment, and the influence of medical drugs such as ADD and behavioral modification drugs have on both children and adults' ability to learn. You categorize philosophy as what we value and what we are unwilling to sacrifice, but I have found that to be functional, a living philosophy must be holistic and include Dr. Happiness, being clear on what is happy making for you, taking time to do those things, And what core values will support your ability to thrive? Dr. Movement. What kinds of movement and how much does one need to achieve baseline health first and foremost, and then exercise specific for work, sports, or extracurricular activities? Dr. Diet. The importance of organically grown, clean, nutritious food and high-quality drinking water. One's brain can only be as healthy as their blood and the body that supports it. And diet and hydration are not only essential to the body and to brain health, but one's ability to think and develop their cognitive and creative abilities. Dr. Quiet, getting adequate sleep and rest to restore the body, mind, and adequate introspection time to cultivate a relationship with oneself. Physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual stress factors accumulate, elevate stress hormones, and keep stress students in a state of left brain dominance. How can our education systems educate without education on what it takes to produce a healthy enough student to effectively learn in the first place? So I would love to hear your thoughts on why what I've just outlined as 4 doctors aren't inherently embedded in the school system, because I know damn well from a lot of research that what they feed kids in school is straight up poison. It's microwave crap. They have no consciousness of the water. They've cut education, physical education out of most schools. And the most common excuse given is because they don't have enough money to pay for computers. So they cut the physical education department out. I mean, the research that's available on the effect of exercise on a child's capacity to learn is phenomenally significant. So here we have all these tech companies coming in, but we're pouring tons of money into the development of unhealthy children who are being put on lots of drugs, who are becoming behaviorally dysfunctional, sexually dysfunctional, gender confused, and lots of other stuff. So as a philosopher and a smart guy, I'd like to know, what do you think about this, and what do you want to do about it?
Yeah, so I think that most fundamentally, I think the problem that we have is that there is this very myopic nature to how we've, and the thing we've kind of talked about the myopic nature of the standardized testing. We've talked about the myopic nature of the tech companies' narrative. And I think that those two things combined actually is a reason why we've kind of moved away from focusing on other aspects of a child's development that I think are important and we know are important. And so when you think about things like the cutting of various, health programs, behavioral specialists in schools, safety programs, all of that in light of just trying to get more technology in the classroom, is because we've convinced ourselves that that's the most important thing that a child needs when they graduate, is to be able to get a very particular type of job. And I think that when we only think about school's purpose as job readiness, and building a particular skill set for those jobs, I think that's what narrows the scope of the responsibilities that we feel towards our students. When you think about the chapter on the stakes of education, I talk about 3 main things that we probably should think about when we think about why we teach students. And so one is, of course, the job is important, right? Like you need a job to survive in our society. And so we want to make sure our students can get a job. There's 2 other ones that are also really important for why we send kids to schools. The second one is civic development. And that's making sure that the other people who are voting for in your society are also well educated and can have a conversation with you, and you can talk through things and figure out what's right for you, you as a country, you as a city, whatever it may be. And to do that, that's why we do have a shared project of schooling, so that when you have those conversations with your peers, they're also well educated, and there's some shared common understanding that you can base those conversations and votes and policies off of, whether it be really local or at the national level. The final one, and I think that's the one that you're really getting at here, is the personal flourishing angle, which is, it's not just about what you're contributing out to the world. It's also how you feel about yourself, right? And
yes,
that is dependent on a lot of different things that I think we sometimes shortchange and think that schools can do all of that, which is also right. Like there is a limitation to how much schools can actually solve some of these external factors. but also the things that we can solve at schools we aren't. And so like every day there's headlines right now about schools that don't have money for air conditioning systems, and in the classrooms are like 95 degrees and the kids are sitting through that. But those same schools are investing in figuring out what the latest AI tool that they can bring for their teachers is. And there's a massive disconnect here about what those fundamental needs that every human has before they can access education and learning. And I think that disconnect between that is problematic. I think the focus on healthier food, like we don't teach students how to think about food. And so, oftentimes we might think that not all of this is the responsibility of a school, but a lot of this, especially at the earlier age levels, is something that we used to teach, right? There used to be a much deeper relationship between actual, healthy habits and external world, but also something that we should take responsibility of as schools to even educate parents about, right? So like maybe, the school can't possibly regulate sleep in a way that's meaningful, but
it can educate on it.
Right. It can educate the child on the dangers of not sleeping. It can educate the child on the dangers of having a blue screen with you in bed. But it can also share those resources with parents, especially because, we live in a country where access to that information is not equal. And so one easy way to make sure every kid has a parent or a guardian at home who can support all these things that the school is trying to do is by also sharing that information directly with parents. Because I think that then when they go home, it's the same messaging and the same sort of support systems in place. And right now it is the Wild West in terms of a lot of these different habits that really require a continuous journey, not only in school, but also at home.
Well, what's happening over the years, because I've been in my career now for 42 years, is parents are getting more and more sick and more physically unfit, more and more sedentary, more and more outsourcing their own cognitive abilities to technology. And so the paradox is that the kids are being raised by sick, disconnected people that are falling into the same trap that the schools are falling into, which for the future of humanity does not look good. Because if education is not educating you how to live and how to navigate the realities of the experience of life, then you're not being educated. You're actually being distracted from what's really important. And it seems to me that it would be a great idea that all schools, just like, we don't have education on how to be parents, strangely enough. And we don't have education on what happens when you actually enter into a marriage. How does your life change? There's a difference between being single and sport sex and goofing around and getting married and having a committed relationship and then getting pregnant and now having to deal with the rigors of raising a child. Like it boggles my mind as a man with children and who educates a lot of people. I'm forever with my clients having to deal with the crisis of relationship and the crisis of raising children. And, we have a massive problem in the world right now with young men that just cannot stick through the challenges of a relationship. So we end up with all these single mothers out there who are burning themselves out, trying to wear the pants and the dress at the same time. So it seems like we really actually need to collectively worldwide say, what is it that we really need education on? And we should have an education program at every school for parents on what it means to educate a child and how do you support a child to be educated. Like a child's got to have sleep. They shouldn't be up watching junk television all night and surfing the internet. They should be eating real food. They should be drinking water, not soda pop. Because otherwise what happens is kids go into these very cool ed tech environments, but they're drinking soda pop and eating garbage, and they have attention deficit problems and health problems like crazy. And though you can't, Priten, really learning is hard work. Carl Jung said, real thinking is hard work. That's why most people simply rearrange their prejudices and call it thinking. And that's a very serious problem today. And so I know this isn't something that it's your responsibility to solve, but because you've put so much effort into making such an important book, it seems to me you got to get volume 2 out and get down to the bedrock, because just as the soil is the foundation of the health of plants, and animals eat the plants grown in the soil, and we eat the animals and the plants, if the soil's toxic and poisonous, so are we. So running to doctors to take pills for what begins at the farm means we need to actually understand food and soil science and farming as a means of having healthy families and healthy people and healthy education systems. But it's completely void, and it didn't used to be. I can prove that to you. I could walk you right into my library over there and pull out 40 or 50 books going back to the 1940s. For example, the Lady Eve Balfour's book, The Living Soil and the Holly Experiment, where there's multiple cases of schools, private schools, who found that the quality of the food they were buying in the late 40s was so low that it was causing kids to have a hard time learning, and they decided to start their own organic gardens, and they did. And one of the most common things that happened when new kids came to these schools where they were feeding their own organic food in their own kitchens, private schools, was the kid would go through a detox crisis. And it would usually be about 2 weeks where they had flu-like symptoms, and they had to warn new parents coming in, we use organic food that we raise here, and the kids learned how to do the farming too. And your kid might go through a detox crisis. And it's not that they're getting sick. But so I could give you many other books, but we've lost all that. And look what the state of the world is now. We're actually destroying the entire ecosystem for efficiency. And the medical system's taking it right to the friggin' bank, and the wrong people are winning. The ed tech companies are winning. The drug companies are winning. But we're losing. And so this is not education. It's a complete, it's a bunch of mental masturbation that's leading us to a dead-end road. And I don't mean to be so fiery. I don't take this personally, but I'm saying I'm personally requesting somebody with your clout and your background start ringing the friggin' bell so we wake parents up to what education really is, because it begins right in the soil and right in the bedroom and right in the living room at home, or we don't have an education system. We just don't. We have something else, which is probably a tech indoctrination system.
Yeah, and I think that is the impetus for the book. That is the impetus for a lot of the work I do. Is can we have a conversation about what we actually want for our children, and then build all of the systems around that, rather than figuring out how do we just like make these like piecemeal little improvements based on these external rhetoric. Because I think one of the things that we really need to figure out going forward is how do we disconnect the focus of decision making in schools from being led just by external vendors. Like that is a huge part of this, and a huge reason why I think we get so much of the tech mediated conversations. Now, we are seeing some small improvements, right? Like there are a lot of schools now that are banning cell phones in schools. And so there's some research finally coming out that shows that like there's a little spike in the short term of like behavioral problems because like kids are lashing out and getting in trouble more. But it goes away because students learn how to self-regulate, and they learn how to deal with their, when they're frustrated or when they're bored, like being able having to sit with that is teaching them something. And so folks are trying to do various things in a piecemeal way. And I think that the more we can have conversations about what that needs to be, I think the more of that we will see. I just hope it doesn't take, it took 15 years, 10 years for us to get there with cell phones. I'm just hoping we don't spend that much time doing this with AI. But also I'm hoping we can kind of have the larger, and I say this in the book in the very beginning, is that like the book is not, the good chunk of the book is just about education and is not necessarily about technology. And I think that I write about education technology because it's people want to hear about it right now. It's what people are most concerned about right now. But a lot of the types of philosophical thinking that I talk about in the book can can be used for any sort of decision making about education, whether it be about like, when do we integrate a health class? How much physical education do we give? Like, how much do we involve parents in some of this educational endeavors? Like, those kinds of questions are all answerable with the first third of the book, even though the book is technically about education technology. Because I think at the most fundamental level, I think we need to be thinking more ethically about our children. Like that, I think that is the larger question, is we need to be asking what our values are and how do we act on those values, rather than this like Band-Aid approach of, we see XYZ problem, let's figure out how to solve it, and try to redesign both, what we do at home, but also what we do in our schools around what we actually want for our children.
I agree. Values are the bedrock of decision making. I tell people your yes has no value until you learn to say no, and you don't know when to say no without core values. And I think, we probably need a serious course on values for parents, for educators, for tech companies. And that's an issue that's really serious across almost every discipline in the world right now. We've lost touch with our field of values. And so you end up getting a bunch of pirates just running away with shit.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we also, there's a lot of fear when it comes to talking about values, because I think people have this connotation that it has to be this really contentious, really difficult conversation about like a very political conversation. And I think the most important thing is that you don't need a lot of shared values to have a productive conversation in a society, right? Like you do need some fundamental shared values, and that's what makes a democracy healthy. But we don't have to agree on everything to figure out how some of our institutions can serve these long ends, because most of us we do have a lot of shared values that we all can use our schools and all of that to kind of realize. And so, you and I might not agree on every single thing and every single policy matter and every single political matter, but like you and I agree that there's a particular fulfilling life that we want every child to live who graduates school, and we can build a school system that you and I would agree on based on that value system without even having to really get to every single political issue that you and I might disagree on. And so I think that fear of, oh my gosh, like we're going to have to deal with these really complicated topics that everybody's like, already has their mind made up about in order to figure out what our schools look like. I think that's causing us to hesitate from sharing. Wait, when you put most parents and most teachers in one single room in the country, no matter which part of the country they're from, and you really ask them what they want for the children, you're going to get the same answer no matter what their other political beliefs are. And I think we can build our schools around that and get somewhere with that and actually focus on that and not be so scared of those conversations.
I think that's a bullseye. I mean, how many parents wouldn't say one of my values is having a healthy child? Well, good. We start there. What does that mean? How about how important is it to have a healthy environment for your child to not only live in at home, but to be educated in? Okay, we can agree upon that. You bring a kid into a poisonous environment full of electromagnetic pollution and toxic paints and whatever else. And the amount of studies I've read on that shows that this stuff can all be fixed up easily is mind-blowing. And so what I'm saying, I'm reiterating that it's just a few key values. What religion you practice, that doesn't matter. You still have to eat. You still need water. You still need a healthy environment, and you still need a good teacher. So there you go.
Right.
Some values are secondary and some are primary, and we have to agree. What do we all want together? Well, we want to be alive tomorrow.
Right.
We want to eat real food. We want to drink clean water. We don't want chemtrails poisoning our skies. There's unless anybody that says that they want that is already so far down the tubes, they need serious psychological evaluation. So some of the things are just blatantly obvious, but the paradox of it is that some of the most important things in life are blatantly obvious, but they recede into the background and people stop thinking about them. Like if you knew right now, for example, what toxins were in most people's bottled water, it would shock the hell out of people, but they just assume it's water. So there's an example of a value that fades into the background, but comes back to bite you when you got cancer and your doctor says, oh, by the way, you got to stop drinking all this water out of plastic bottles because you've estrogenized your body, your hormonal system screwed up, and now you got cancer because of it. Oh, nobody told me that. Yeah, it should be common sense, but common sense isn't common anymore. We got to get back to common sense values and build an education foundation from common sense up. Just like you have to go from general education to specialized education, or you get a bunch of smart, dumb people. Yeah. Like we have a world full of fit, sick people. I coined that term 25 years ago because you have all these athletes that got beautiful washboard abs, but they got livers that are failing them and kidneys that are failing them, and they're using steroids to try to cheat the system. You know, that's the problem we have. We're using educational steroids with AI. And it comes at a problem. It's a problem. Anyhow, I've really enjoyed this dialogue with you, Priten. Thank you for your work. And thank you for this excellent book. It's been an honor to be able to get you some exposure and I feel gratified to know there's a guy like you out there who's grounded in philosophy and grounded in the actual thinking process, and not just cookie cutting it and making it easy all the time, and that values the friction of real education. As we close the podcast, could you feel free to share any closing commentary you might like to close with? Anything else you'd like to offer? Ventures, offerings, contact information, however you'd like to close.
Yeah. So I think the first is, the most important thing that I think hoping folks can grab from this is that we need to be talking more about this. That is really the starting place. I think we oftentimes jump to decision making and jump to kind of advocating for things, but I think fundamentally we need to sit down and have conversations. And so whatever I can do to facilitate that, that's the goal. The book ends with the words, "Let's talk," and I really do mean that. And so if folks want to reach out, my personal website is priten.org. That's just my first name.org. And you can kind of find everything there. There's a newsletter. There's the podcast that we brought up earlier. Both of those nonprofits are linked from there. And there's a contact form to reach me directly that actually goes to me. So if anybody wants to have conversations, think about what this means in their school system, talking to their teacher about it, or if you're an educator who's looking to bring this kind of work into your school, that's the best place to start, is preten.org.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
This was really good. I really appreciated it.
You're a fun guy to have a good rap session with. No,
this is great. There was a lot. I feel like we got to a lot of the meat and bones that sometimes we don't get to in a quicker conversation, or a conversation that gets focused on like very, what is this? Like, XYZ school is doing this XYZ thing. What do you think about it? I feel like we were able to talk about the broad thing, which is my goal. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, well, I don't believe in fast food education. That's clear. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks to all of you guys. I hope you really enjoyed this. If you're a parent, I know this must have been a very important dialogue for you to engage in. And if you're still here, I know it was important. And thanks to all of my sponsors for all your awesome products and taking great care of the planet, the farmers, and us. And thanks to any of you for buying from the sponsors. That supports me so I can keep the podcast going and find more amazing people like Priten to bring to you and help you find the best books and the best people with the greatest minds to help us all live and love more fully. So I look forward to having something awesome for you next week. Ho, great spirit. We are safe. We are home. We are whole. Thank you, Priten. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Priten Soundar-Shah. You can find out more about Priten's latest book, Ethical EdTech, How Educators Can Lead on AI and Digital Safety in K-12 at ethicaledtech.org. On the website, you can read the first chapter online for free and also get 6 bonus resources with your proof of purchase of the book, including a bonus chapter and a video course that accompanies the book. Priten's website, priten.org, that's priten.org, has a wealth of resources, including links and information about his non-profit ventures, books, and upcoming events. Connect with Priten on Instagram at priten.soundar-shah and LinkedIn at Priten Soundar-Shah. You can listen to his podcast, Margin of Thought, at listen.priten.org. For more interaction with Paul and to get priority notification about an exciting new extension of his Spirit Gym program and community, go to myspiritgym.com and sign up to the waitlist. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the show on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.